Hey everybody, Jonathan Broadbent here, your host of UnWoke Academy. Welcome to another episode. If you're following the 100-100 party, we're at 130 days, 9 hours, 26 minutes, and 4 seconds until 4th of July. That's going to be a huge day. There's a ton of stuff happening in the lead up. We have a lot of new information that's coming in from folks that are signing up with information that we're going to be using to walk through kind of a day in the life or step-by-step case scenarios of helping people and companies to go unwoke. So that detail is coming. We're going to have a huge celebration on the 4th of July when we get to that 100-100. Also connected to that, we have launched the world's first private membership association, or PMA for short, for finance. It's my understanding that we're the first ones out of the gate in the world of finance to use that type of structure. I really truly hope that we are the beginning of a new trend, that lots of people that work in finance grab that idea and run with it. If you know people who work in finance, encourage them to take a look at this and consider PMA as an alternative to typical business structures, which is actually a big part of what I want to talk about today. But before I get into that, I want to give an important tip of the hat to our friends at OBBM Network and blessednewstv.com. I can't imagine better partners in content distribution. They've been tremendously helpful in getting us cleaned up, polished, organized, and out there so that people like you can find us and listen to our message. If you too have some message you'd like to get out, get a hold of the folks at OBBM Network and blessednewstv.com. They can help, and their platforms and the technology is awesome. On a side note connected to that, OBBM Network is now available on Roku TV. So if you have Roku and are able to download smart apps to your smart device, look for OBBM Network and you can hear my voice and people like us. The I guess I want to call us the upstart new voices of conservative media. So we're very thankful for both OBBM Network and blessednewstv.com. I want to dive into today's topic by starting with the expression that is attributed to Ronald Reagan, and that is the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I've been talking a lot over the last few years about weaponized regulators. And I think we can see in a number of different capacities in a number of different arenas these 3-letter agencies that can and will attack American citizens and small business enterprise. They've been doing it for a long time, and I think we're finally waking up to it. As a connected sort of a note, I don't know about the average layperson in the US, but I think there was a general awakening and awareness. The Internal Revenue Service was kind of targeting conservative, right leaning organizations and slow tracking their applications for nonprofit status. And effectively, we're giving more voice and a faster track to liberal, left-leaning nonprofit organizations. So that really threw a lot of people. It made some national headlines, and there was some backlash against the IRS. Well, they're not the only ones, and I think we're coming to realize that. And as a society, we're coming to understand that our government is not a friend of free business enterprise. And those of us on the individual level who seek autonomy, independence, freedom, and things like escape from snooping and surveillance. I'm going to draw a parallel today between finance and business and churches and religious organizations. Now, bear with me a second here. I think you'll see where I'm headed with this, and I'm positive that this will make sense in a moment. But imagine for a moment that you are a religious individual. It doesn't matter if you are or are not. Um, I personally hope for your sake that you have great happiness in life, and often that comes from finding religion. But whatever your circumstances are, just bear with me a second here. It's a hypothetical. Imagine you go through some sort of clergy and decide that you would like to start a house of worship. I'm just going to call it a church. So you decide that you want to start a church. What we've learned to do, what we've been sort of adapted to think, is the very first thing that you need to do is go out and fill out a whole bunch of forms with different governmental entities, including the IRS, and seek tax exempt status, and then file as a certain type of business. And I've I've been doing it since I was 26. When I was 26, I formed my own company, and I remember going through the discussions with accountants and with lawyers, and we had to decide if I was going to be a sub S corporation or a C corporation, and then we you can decide on things like an LLC, which stands for Limited Liability Corporation, and there are all these steps to go through. And then once you get that, you have to apply for what's referred to as an EIN, which stands for Employer Identification Number, and I've had several of those through my lifetime and my career. And then you have to pay some lawyers to create some articles of incorporation, and those have to be updated, et cetera. And so there's sort of this funnel that businesses get put into, and you follow that funnel, and you can consistently keep filling out paperwork and adjusting things and changing stuff. And you have to fill out these governmental forms and submit to all sorts of government regulation that's attached to them in order to stay compliant with the requirements to maintain those documents. So in the case of clergy or a church, churches, the first thing that they seem to all want to do is achieve nonprofit status. And at its surface, it's very understandable because you are ready to get at the pulpit and conduct yourself, and you want a church full of people, churchgoers, to come in. It also is a business. So, first thing to recognize is that churches are a business. They have to have cash flow, they have to have money in to pay the bills, to keep the lights on, to maintain the structure, etc. And understandably, at least partly understandably, historically, all of those churches, or nearly all of them, want to find their way to get to tax exempt status. That's referred to as 501c3. That's the code that allows them to be tax exempt. That applies to many of the things that we just sort of fall into the habit of doing relative to these three-letter agencies, including the IRS, but not limited to them. So when churches go through that step of achieving 501c3 tax exempt status, it means that they are then indefinitely, for the life of the church, presumably, they're under the thumb of that agency. And so now we've gotten to the point where I would argue any church or religious organization can pretty well go as far left as they might want to at the pulpit. But any pastor, priest, minister, rabbi, you name it, anybody with a tax exempt status who starts to deviate just even a little bit to the right, I think we're at that point now where we all know that there is danger. Danger lies ahead. And there's a lot of sort of self-regulation that comes into play. And I hear it often from people who are various religious entities, like very much like social media, with groups like Facebook and platforms that have been crushing free speech for a long time and really beating up on anybody who comes out as even remotely conservative or right-leaning. We're self-censoring. And I make the argument, I continue to make the argument often, that at the pulpit is a dangerous place to have that. If we have churches all over the US, and I believe that we absolutely do, that can get up at the podium and say whatever they want effectively and get a free pass if they're left leaning, but are very cautious about saying anything that's right leaning, what we've done is we've migrated away from biblical principles. Because sometimes, let's face it, there are some true hard realities that need to be faced and talked about from the pulpit. And our religious leaders can't do that under that environment if they're under the thumb of those three-letter agencies. The answer to that has actually been around since, I believe, long before the United States formed. I think I want to say it was the 1200s or something. Something called the Black Robe Society was formed in order to use the clergy to advocate for freedoms, liberties, personal autonomy, and against the overreach of government. I'm just going to sort of paraphrase it that way. It's my understanding that the Black Robe Society, if you haven't heard of it, look it up. It's really cool. The history, I'm just starting to learn a little bit about it. And I've actually discovered that a friend of mine is part of the Black Robe Society, which is awesome. These are people who believe so strongly in the importance of their ability to speak freely from the pulpit that they have eschewed, they have shunned that 501c3 tax exempt status. To them, they've decided it's not worth it to be under the thumbscrews of government. They need to be able to speak freely and speak from the heart and from what they believe to be true biblical principles. So remember, this is just an analogy. I'm not trying to convince you of anything or proselytize or get you to convert or become something. It's just an example. And it relates in my book directly to the way businesses operate as well. The same thing is happening in the business world. We in the business world, and again, if I've mentioned this, starting at the age of 26, I remember vividly the process of going through filing for I had to decide on the legal structure of my organization, and that it was I was a sub S pass-through entity. I had to get my employer identification number, and then I had to maintain that. I used to fill out, it was called an ST10, quarterly estimated earnings, and I had to maintain all of this stuff. And businesses, very similar to churches and clergy, have to go through, they believe they have to go through those steps of filing with all these three-letter agencies. And then once they do, kind of like me in finance, when I went out on my own some years ago, it was over a decade ago, I left the big Wall Street firms and decided I wanted to start and form my own company. And it was a major ordeal. It was about a year-long process of filling out the paperwork and the forms and the filings and different entities that oversee. I think at the start there were six or more different agencies that I had to file with, and the IRS, et cetera. And so what I've ended up with is similar to those people at the pulpit, the church. I've ended up in an environment where, like most businesses now, if you show yourself to be a little bit right-leaning, these agencies will come in and try to crush you. Well, there's some magic that happens at that point. Either people just cave with fear, and I think that's what's expected, and that's what a lot of people will do, because it's understandable. It's a crazy thing. When you put everything that you've got and you put your entire life on the line for a business, and you believe in that so strongly that you put your all into starting some business venture, and then let's say something changes or something happens, or like me, you kind of venture into the political realm. I have to air quote that because I never thought it was political when I first started. I started advocating because my wife ran for school board in a far left-leaning, ultra-liberal, progressive community. We saw what was happening in schools and the degradation of K through 12 education. I started advocating for that, but lo and behold, that sort of outed me as a conservative, which is, it's even still to this day, all these years later, it just strikes me as crazy because I just figured education was universal and all parents want that, but that's not apparently the case. Um, But anytime in any of these environments, if you are under the thumb of government regulation, they can control your behavior. That's what I'm kind of trying to describe through using that analogy of churches and clergy and being at the pulpit and speaking every whatever it is, Saturday or Sunday or whatever your religious preference is. um, as somebody who takes that mantle of leadership, your first instinct, hopefully, should be to take it seriously and think in terms of what's the most beneficial value to those people who look to you for guidance. And I think for most, an admirable starting point because they're thinking in terms of the best possible advice they can be giving. In my case, that's the world of finance, and there are parts of the world of finance that I know arguably better than most anybody else alive. I know in great detail these areas of finance. And when I went to the big Wall Street firms, assuming, silly me, I was young and apparently not well informed, I thought that I was going there to serve those clients. What I was doing is going to a mega firm, globalist in nature, that was definitely, absolutely under the thumb screws of those regulated governmental entities and organizations. And so the, I'll try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't think they had a choice about how they could behave. It was all about how much money you can make, how much you can twist the accounts to capitalize. At the end of the day, they are subjects. They're subjects of the will of the whatever regulatory agencies and entities oversee what they do. There's this veneer, if you will, of freedom and autonomy, but it doesn't really truly exist. Because if you do something that is deemed inappropriate, very much like on social media. And if you have Facebook experience like I do, you may know that all it takes is some innocuous post that somebody somewhere doesn't like. Like in my state, 2 years ago, I referenced some candidates for governor of the state. Those actually came back and haunted me years later. I had a 30-day Facebook jail for posting that. There was nothing wrong or inappropriate about it. I was talking about Republican candidates, and those were just candidates that I believed would be better than the alternative. And for the egregious error of having posted that, I spent like a long period of time in Facebook jail. But then that goes back to that whole idea: do we self-censor, or do we face into that and fight back and find alternative platforms? So, considering all of that, private membership associations are a spectacular answer to this whole equation, because we have the foundations, the legal foundations, all the way up to the Supreme Court rulings a long time ago, decades ago, in the 60s and 70s, that addressed our freedom to run things like private membership associations. It's well established. And PMA, private membership associations, have been around for a long time. Their time in society, in the business world, has come. The time is now. I truly believe that there is probably nothing that's not applicable to private membership associations. So I have worked hard over the last couple of years to launch this thing. And just like I encourage churches to switch, yes, it is a process. Once you've established 501c3, it's not as easy as turning it off and switching to something other than a 501c3, but it's worth it. I've heard from a number of people who have gone through those steps. Once they actually have control of their church back and they're not under the thumb of those weaponized agencies, there's a lot more that they can do and say much more freely. And in the business world, and in my case, the financial services world, when I talk to my clients, I actually will not allow the concept of some globalist financial agency telling me what I can and cannot do. And as an extreme example, there was a period of time where I worked for a firm that had a deep relationship with banks. And I was invited periodically to go out and spend time in these bank branches. And I traveled around. It was actually at first there were 4 branches, and that grew to, I think by the time I resigned, it was 13 different bank branches. And I would go out and spend time in the bank branches and try to educate people and encourage them and give them better answers than they might get without somebody like me. And one of the crazy things, right before I resigned, they switched their entire business model to a menu. It was actually a one-page menu, and it was like, these are the things that you're allowed to talk about. Well, if you know anything about the world of finance, even just mutual funds as one example, mutual funds at the time, there were about 17,000 mutual funds available. I'm not going to read from a page if I'm talking to somebody in a bank branch and choose from one of 15 different things to talk about, like 9 mutual funds and 4 other things. That to me is that's a non-starter. I will not do that. That is so thoroughly unprofessional. It's ridiculous. Um, and that in some environments is the way that some people and businesses are forced to run themselves. And we see examples all the way into food right now. There is an Amish farmer somewhere in Pennsylvania I've been reading about who is fighting the Food and Drug Administration or agriculture or whatever, whoever oversees food. So they make this wonderful, healthy, delicious, nutritious food. And the whole community, lots of people love this Amish farmer. But the government is attacking and trying to shut down the Amish farmer and force the Amish farmer into selling what I certainly argue is less nutritious, more mass manufactured food product. It's horrible. These are the things that we need to get better at fighting, and that's why I launched the first private membership association. I will consistently put those out there. I want more people thinking in terms of going from 501c3 to something else and switching their business model from business filed with IRS and all the other agencies into a private membership association. Get free, get out from under. Remember the 9 scariest words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. They're not a help. Get out from under. I'm Jonathan Broadbent. This has been another episode of UnWoke.Academy.